Is it record? Okay. So a very warm welcome to this, one of our EWOP Impact Incubator sessions. And this webinar is looking at workplace violence, particularly harassment and aggression prevention. So we're joined today by some very illustrious people, not just in terms of our delegates, but also in terms of some ongoing friends of EWOP Incubator. So our plan for today is that we're going to have two short presentations. Hopefully this will, hang on, sorry, let me just, I love it when technology works. Okay. No, okay. So we're joined today by Roberta Frida from Aston University, and Roberta leads our Threats and Securities strand for the EWOP Impact Incubator. And she's going to be talking an ongoing piece of work that she's been doing with the Italian government on workplace aggression, creating a framework and a toolkit. I'll be also presenting some recent work in terms of some animations that we have that are related particularly to sexual violence in this space. And then we've got a panel, and we are just to be able to include long-term friends of the Impact Incubator. So Anna Catalina Ramez is a technical specialist on the Occupational Safety and Health Group for the International Labour Organization in Geneva in Switzerland. She's been with the ILO since 2007, initially starting as a technical specialist in HIV and AIDS in the world of work for the ILO's Decent Work country team. And then since 2017, she's transitioned into much more of an occupational safety and health and working environment branch at the headquarters of ILO. And she continues in this role, and particularly overseeing technical initiatives that are related to things that are very close to work psychology's heart. So particularly looking at mental health in the workplace, violence and harassment, occupational safety and health within the informal economy, occupational health services, and gender issues. So we're delighted to include her. She recently attended a summer school for EWOP, and also I'm working closely with them on a work-related violence assessment report and toolkit, which will be out very shortly. We're also including in our panel Peter Cheese, who has for many years been an ongoing friend of the Impact Incubator in his capacity as the Chief Executive for the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development in the UK, which is the main professional body for health and for human resource specialists in this field. So he has long pioneered real attention looking at safer cultures and workplaces, and in particular helping HR professionals and their employers and also government in navigating this space. So we're going to conclude with a panel for them recognising and thinking about this in more detail. So I'm now over to Roberta, who is going to take us into our first session. Please, Roberta.
Thank you very much, and I will try now to share my screen, and if I am able, here we go. So what I'm going to present shortly is just a quick snapshot of the work that I've been doing as part of a grant funded by INAIL that is basically the health and safety part of the government in Italy. So the work that I've been doing is really around prevention of workplace aggression. We all know that workplace aggression is a serious matter, is widespread, is costly. We know that unfortunately good amount of employees experience conflict or abuse in the workplace. In the healthcare context, Some health professionals are experiencing even more frequency of bullying and harassment. For example, we know about nurses, but we also know that minority group are also experienced higher level. So we do know that prevention matter, but what we wanted to explore in this piece of work was actually looking at the policies. So our aim was to explore what the policy are telling us in relation to different aspects of workplace aggression. We know that policy set the foundation for legal accountability, for organizational responses, and preventative measures. So the idea was, can we look at how they are defining aggression? What are the strategies that they are proposing for assessing, monitoring, and preventing, but also how prevention is actually defined? And then, are they looking at workplace aggression? And I'm using this term as an umbrella term to consider a broad range of behaviors from incivility, so less severe forms of aggression, to physical harm and physical aggression, violence, and sexual harassment. So we wanted to look at, are they looking at the different actors that are involved in this dynamic, so the perpetrator, targets, and bystander, and how much they are considered when it comes to suggesting or orienting employers for prevention. We were also interested in how much the policies are guiding employers in relation to the cyber form of aggression. So I'm not going to the detail of the methods, but we did quite a thorough approach, scanning the different policies available in different countries. We looked at the UK, and we looked at obviously the legislations. We also used a broad database, and we look at specifically the HSC Northern Ireland, and the ACAS to see their guidelines. We were very pleased to have a very broad range of colleagues and stakeholders in our steering group. We did in three contexts: the UK, Italy, and broader the European Union context. As you can see, the numbers of the policies we mapped is quite large. So we looked at more than 8,000 just in the UK, 3,000 and almost 6,000 in EU. But the amount of policy documents that were relevant for our purpose varied across the three contexts, and you can see here. So I just wanted to very quickly summarize some of the gaps that we identified. So one is, unfortunately, we didn't find good consistency in terms of how the different aggressive behaviors are defined. And so while in certain policy document, for example, bullying was defined as a one-off, in another context was more aligned with the literature, talking about repeating, for example, exposure to certain behaviors, while in some contexts they were mentioning behaviors at work, but this created also a problem, because what happens when people are not at work, but the aggression is related to themselves. So we also found that there was a lack of guidance in relation to workplace aggression that is happening through basically IT devices. So when people are remote or home working, so we are talking about cyber forms of aggression. Another kind of aspect that was missing is actually the bystanders. You can see from this figure that when we talk about workplace aggression, we need to take into account the perpetrator, the target, but also the bystanders, that they're the people that indirectly experience aggression. And they have a massive role, because they can intervene if and when is possible, but also raising concern after and provide support. At the same time, we know that bystanders are actually affected in terms of health and well-being by the indirect exposure to aggression. We also found that although all these documents discussed the importance of monitoring, we found a lack of guidance about how things need to be monitored. For example, which tools and instruments are good practices resources. We know, for example, from the literature, that if we are using single item, so basically when people are asked, do you see yourself as a victim of bullying, or have you experienced bullying or sexual harassment in your workplace, this means that people need to define themselves as target of bullying. And we know from the literature that unfortunately this type of measures might create information about underexposure. And prevention is not really defined. What do we mean by prevention? So briefly, what we have done, and again, in collaboration with all our colleagues, a part of the steering group, was actually starting defining what does it mean primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. For all the people that are, they know about preventative measure in health, these are not uncommon names. We talk about primary prevention before the aggression happens, so reduce the risk of occurrence. Secondary prevention is mitigation, the consequences, but also reducing the likelihood of escalation and reoffending. And then tertiary prevention. So when we need to support employees in recovering from the prolonged consequences of aggression, and also reducing the risk of perpetrators from recidivism. And as you can see, we have not just defined what does it mean primary, secondary, and tertiary. We also are suggesting that it's important to identify the specific measures in relation to perpetrator, target, and bystander. And this is a kind of a framework that we have suggested. And this means that we have also suggesting some specific measure that can be adopted for the different types of prevention. In our project, we have developed this framework, but we also realized that we lack toolkit and supporting tools for employers. And this is why we developed a workplace aggression prevention toolkit that has been designed to, is not offering magic recipes, but is actually helping employers, HR, and professionals to reflect about how to prevent. It has been designed to have case studies so that the organization can actually engage and reflect about what they are currently doing and areas in which they need to further develop measures or trainings to support prevention. We have also developed, to be even more pragmatically and maybe useful for organization, a dashboard. And this is a dashboard in which organization can put their information, and this is more about policy, is helping them assessing their current approaches and then identifying possible gaps. And this is the way the dashboard look like, that really helps them seeing and receiving a report based on their current situation. This is what we have done, and my last in a way slide is a reflection that prevention is everyone's job. And when we talk about prevention, we need to think about we need a joint responsibility and collaboration. On one side, policy, leadership, regulators, and HR. And we need to be mindful that code of conducts alone are not enough. If we want to prevent, we need trainings, we need reporting, but we need to build a cultural systems that reinforces ethical behavior, but also create a psychological safe environment where people feel able and confident and safe to report or raising concern. And we need something that allows organization to monitor where are they in the journey of prevention. So this is what I wanted to briefly share, and we are developing a website where these resources will be. This has been also with the support of the EWOP. So shortly there will be a website, but in the meantime, if you are interested in receiving a copy, and it's all free, please do let me know. Thank you so much, Ross, and I'll go back to you.
questions about this, please do put them in the chat for us. Okay, so what I'm going to be focusing now is a second presentation that's kind of building on this, but looking at it specifically within the forum of sexual violence and abuse. So just to alert people that this is a sensitive topic, and unfortunately it can be triggering. This is from my own local area in terms of support that people can get. So what I'm interested in, and I'd like to acknowledge the support that we've had from a variety of different funders and regulators and other groups, is really to highlight that this is a particularly difficult context when we look at it within a health and social care workforce, because this is the workforce that is supposed to be looking after people. So these type of events don't occur within a dark alley. They occur within very bright spaces such as operating theatres or in the back of ambulances, paramedics. They involve spaces where people are particularly vulnerable in terms of their health conditions and needing care and requiring care, or they're in very private spaces where people are working together. So thinking about this, what we want to identify is that we know that this is a particularly hard area, and myself and have really commented on this in great detail. So in particular, it's a space where it's difficult for people to raise their concerns, but also for those concerns to be heard. It's also an area where I'm not going to go through all of these, but particularly there is a moral licensing in which people might view themselves as somehow good, and therefore they discount their behaviours in a variety of different ways. So drawing on work, and in particular our prevention focus that's in a forthcoming book, we are really looking at Bandura's framework of understanding sexual violence as a particular type of behaviour, and there's an interaction with the type of individuals that undertake this, and also in terms of the environment that it happens in. So adopting a prevention focus together with Erica Bowen and Louise Stone, we've created this framework. So starting to draw on medical context to understand this in more details. So in particular, what we want to highlight is that this doesn't take place in an isolated domain. This is reflecting what is going on within the wider workplace and within the wider national context for people that might make them much more tolerant and inured to it. So in particular, in the animations that we've created, we've really sought to myth bust here around the fact that this is, as Roberta has highlighted, generally an underreported issue, and that people tend to, very, very small proportion are likely to be false reports. These are spaces that occur for particular groups, and in particular understanding, as we shift into a primary focus, who are those particular groups. And in particular within this space, we've really highlighted that it's learners and people in education, but also people who are particularly vulnerable from a variety of issues. These are spaces that can be depleting, and so people end up unable to marshal the resources that they need to undertake and to interrogate their behaviour in the same way. These are also spaces where there are rules, but people are not following the rules, particularly around do no harm. And there are spaces, particularly in terms of learners coming into that space, in which there are vulnerable groups and in which there are different norms, so that there might be the way that the shadow way that is done in an organisation, the main way. So as we start thinking about this, and these are images from our animation that's freely available, we need to think particularly around learners in this space who don't understand what the policies are. Often they don't understand what's correct behaviour here, because if they undertook in a normal space the type of things that they're learning about and the behaviours that they're learning in terms of their skills within a supermarket, for example, they're likely to be arrested. So they don't also know how to raise concerns, and particularly if they're overseas staff, they may not understand the social context of this, or they may feel that there are particular cultural barriers. So thinking about then from a secondary focus, we need here very much to think about the terms that we use within the animation are around trying to help people understand why they might be targeted in different ways. And so through that, that can involve an individual giving their trust to their colleague or to their patient in this space, and then that trust is betrayed. And this can have life-changing implications for them, but specifically it takes away their agency and control, and this can be an ongoing issue. So within the animation, we've captured the science around, the way I describe this is as if somebody has given you a grenade that the pin has been pulled, and you've got to keep that pin, you've got to keep that grenade together. So keeping a secret can have huge implications for a person's mental health. It can mean that how they view themselves in terms of the future is taken away and challenged. And so in particular, thinking about how they can navigate and how they can find people to talk to. So here you see in the blue a buddy, somebody who's trained, and they're overhearing somebody else talking about similar experiences and then raise their own concerns with that individual. But all of this secondary focus is very much about creating not just bystanders, but upstanders. So people who can help work with an individual, get them to increase their agency and control and feel like they do want to report. So it's not just thinking about ignoring a situation, it's thinking about how do we report it. So thinking now about the tertiary level, here what we've done within the animation is think about how somebody might be an unreliable witness as a perpetrator for their own behaviours, so that they morally disengage in different ways. So they don't see this as detrimental, they don't take responsibility for it, they fail to see that it can injure and harm other people, or that they dehumanise the person who they've targeted for it. And so what we're interested in within this animation is thinking about what are the policies, what are the means of controlling, but also in means of investigating in different ways. And a final aspect that we've been focusing on, again, using the animation, is that quandary, and thinking here about how do we avoid harms from reporting to help people. So in particular, what we've been thinking about here is how can we have systems that help to restore to the targets their sense of the lost agency and lost control that they have in this space. So in particular, thinking about how they might return to work feeling very, very small, but then just that having a target-centred, a person-centred approach to this can really help an individual to navigate and feel that they can come back. So very much having a trauma-informed workforce so that immediately that they're stepping through that door, they're already feeling bigger, they're already feeling like themselves again. And so in particular here, really understanding that for some professions, this is an incredibly hard thing to do. And this is a quote from some research that we've done, where an individual feels, I'm supposed to be able to do everything. I'm somehow just feeble-minded or silly or not cut out for medicine. What we want to do is understand how to help people navigate and come back into this space. So it's about equipping particularly HR professionals and others investigating to make sure that they're listening and believing people, rather than replicating through endless rounds the experiences of having to tell the stories, each one potentially traumatizing an individual. And then thinking through about how we can have different journeys returning to work that might involve 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sideways, but again, thinking through how can we help people feel that this is person-centric and that they are able to increase their agency and control. So our animations very much focus on an individual who's been targeted, and we've used very simple shapes and colours here. So we have a yellow person who's the target, and individuals trying to help them are the blue individuals, and the perpetrator is a red. So we've looked at, in terms of our prevention focus, 3 different animations, and these are freely available animations for you to use that kind of span the primary, secondary, and also the quandary. So in terms of taking away, in line with what Roberta said, we need to think about violence at work as a symptom, and that it has ripples that are across a whole workplace. These are about understanding what role leaders can play, what role organisational systems can play, and what role HR can play. Are we actually adopting a prevention focus, or could we be siding with the perpetrator? So let me end my sharing there as we go in to our panel now. So thank you. So let me start maybe with Anna Catalina in terms of some thoughts and reflections from an ILO perspective around what you've heard and around violence at work.
Thank you, Rosalind, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for having me on behalf of the ILO today. And it was actually very interesting listening to you both, to the presentations of what you have been doing. And actually, we're very happy to be able to partner with IAWOP in all this work. So let me maybe just put out three main ideas or reflection on how what you have presented, all the work that you have been developing in a certain way matches very well what what we are doing from the ILO, but more specifically what our constituents, namely governments, employers organizations, and workers organizations, are requesting in terms of how to advance addressing violence and harassment in the different workplaces. First of all, I will start by what you said at the end, Rosalind, the importance about prevention. Prevention is one of the most important pillars of the Convention 190, which is the Convention on Violence and Harassment of the ILO, a convention that has gained great attention from member states. That we have to date 51 states that have ratified the convention, if I remember correct the numbers, so it has been, I would say, really a great driver to promote the work on violence against violence and harassment at the workplace. And why prevention? Well, basically because, as you said, prevention is going to help us really to address the underlying causes of violence and harassment and the different determinants at the workplace that enable violence and harassment. And in this sense, the convention, and this is part of the work we have been trying to do, and that is reflected also on what Roberta presented, we have been really putting an accent on the role that we can have through occupational safety and health, basically, or namely through the psychosocial risk assessment and the importance of psychosocial risk assessment and management, more than assessment, when we talked about a preventive strategy for violence and harassment. So linked to that, it's the how, right? So we know this is important. We know that psychosocial risk management offers a great opportunity to prevent in a proactive, systematic, collective, and inclusive manner violence and harassment. But how to do it, how to put it into practice. And this is where actually tools and guidance come into place, and are one of the, I would say, most important requests we receive from our constituents, especially from employers organization. Okay, how can I implement this into my workplace? And this is where, I mean, all these resources that you have shared with us are very important, not only into supporting the process of managing violence and harassment through the different understanding of psychosocial risks at work, and also training, but also by supporting in a certain way the implementation of the different legal frameworks. And here I'm going to get into my second point, which is actually helping the different actors to navigate, I would say, the legal framework. And what I'm saying to navigate, because what we have found in different legal and policy analysis, similar to what Roberta was presenting, is that legislation related to violence and harassment is scattered over the different legal frameworks. So we have some pieces into the criminal law, some pieces into the compensation law, OSH law, labor law. And this is where, for actors, it becomes very complicated, right? So some of the main requests is how we navigate this. And this is how we understand the different definitions. Roberta, you talked about this. So this is where cross-reference, helping understanding legislation into a practical manner, and most important, integrating these different legislations into practice, it's necessary. And I will give just one example of integration. It's just the work we are doing together with IAWOP on violence and harassment and discrimination. How we integrate aspects that are in the labor law, for example, related to discrimination at work, with aspects that may be or are in some cases already integrated into the OSH legislation, such as psychosocial risk management. How we integrate both. And this is a work that we are doing together to try to put in a single tool these aspects that are expressed into different legislations most of the time. And my third point, and I'm closing with this, is something I would say very important for moving forward and for better understanding violence and harassment and how it is expressed. And it's data. We receive a lot of requests on data related to sources. I mean, how do I measure violence and harassment? And this is why, again, I'm back to the tools. Tools are important because they allow us to have baselines at both the workplace level, the organizational level, but also at the national level. The second point on data is how I disaggregate this data to better understand who is being affected mostly because of violence and harassment, or who is more at risk. And the third point, again, related with definitions and legal aspects, is how do I standardize data? And here we're talking about, okay, what are actually we measuring, right? What is the definition that we are using to measure this? How terms are defined and which items are included in the way I measure violence and harassment. And this is another aspect where we receive a lot of requests for support. And finally, but I think this is, I mean, as we said, last but not least, what is the cost of violence and harassment for organizations? Yeah, so this is first, I would say, set of reactions from my side, Rosalind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna Catalina, for your thoughts there. So can I turn now to Peter and ask from an HR perspective about your thoughts here?
Yeah, thank you, Ros, and really interesting to hear the conversation. I mean, from an HR perspective, as you'd highlighted in your talk as well, Ros, I mean, it is a key issue for HR from a number of dimensions, and I want to talk a little bit about the legal frameworks as well. But there's no doubt that we've always seen that part of the function of HR is to help understand and enable supportive workplace cultures. And to understand the things that work against that. And of course, bullying and harassment, and indeed all the way through to violence, are very corrosive parts of any corporate culture and workplace. So they are very, very important to the profession. And how we understand these, what policies we should have, what training we should give managers, and indeed leaders, and how we address some of the questions that you, both Anna and Roberta, raised around understanding what is a spectrum of behaviors which range from what can be seen as bullying, and that's in most countries, I think, although Anna, you know this better than me, doesn't have clear legal definition to it, through into things like harassment, which does have clearer legal definition, because then you're starting to distinguish between bullying and harassment, where harassment is very definitely aimed at protected characteristics. And then, of course, through into things like workplace violence. And then, as you said, Ros, I mean, at the beginning, we are all operating in a context where these issues seem to be growing, not diminishing. And it's very sad. We, as the professional body for HR, put out a lot of guidance on these areas and have done for years. We've been adding to that recently around things like cyber bullying. So we see it as, unfortunately, a growing societal issue, but business operates in a societal context as well. So not only, of course, that we're talking about the more traditional areas, if you will, of bullying and harassment within our workplaces and between colleagues, but is it increasingly between interactions with customers, sometimes even suppliers and others, but in other words, third parties. You mentioned healthcare as an example, but the other ones that have become very, very apparent are in areas like retail and hospitality. So dealing with large segments of the public in environments where it is often not easy to ensure the protection and safety of employees. And there's been a lot of discussion about this in even the recent months, with retailers saying that the level of things like shoplifting, which can lead to violence against staff, let alone bullying and harassment of staff, just continues to rise. So it's a very, very important theme there for us, and it's good to see the kind of guidance that you're also describing here. But if I touch on a number of aspects which and reinforce some points, and so first of all, of course, is the legal frameworks for this. And in the UK, we are going through a lot of consultations with the government, the Labour government, on what's known as the Employment Rights Bill, with a lot of, and they say, the government themselves talk about this being the biggest set of employment rights legislation changes we've seen in a generation. And part of it is definitely focused on areas around bullying and harassment, but increasing the obligation of employers to protect their employees. And with a lot of phrases around employers' duty to take all reasonable steps in proactively preventing things like sexual harassment at work, and actually wider harassment as well, because sexual harassment tends to get you quite quickly into what is a legal definition and is protected under things like the Equalities Act. So it's interesting to see the evolution of the thinking from a legislative perspective. But as you pointed out, I think in your talk, Ros, I mean, first of all, it's how employees understand these things, but also particularly managers and indeed the HR profession itself. And what are reasons and what can I do to create cultures and train managers effectively so I can demonstrate that I am taking those reasonable steps to protect my employees. And we do believe these are really, really important. We've always believed that organizations and employers should see that duty of care to their employees. And this is a critical area of duty of care that employers should be taking. So as I said, there's a lot that we could talk around emerging legislation and comparing between countries, perhaps. But it does also fall into what particularly Roberta and Joanna talked about definitions. How do we properly define the difference between things like bullying and harassment, and what constitutes things like bullying? And we know that also is a complex, as you said, psychosocial debate. There's a lot of different views. I mean, you can hear many people say, well, I wasn't intending to bully. And is that person just being overly sensitive? But actually in law, it's not what your intent is, it's the impact of your action that's the important thing. And yet that takes a lot of training of people to understand that. And I think we still have so many people who, for want of a better way of describing it, grew up in a different era, where what they might see today, what they might describe as banter or joking or whatever, is now no longer acceptable, and arguably never should have been acceptable. There is a far lower tolerance. So the irony in some senses is there's a far lower tolerance in our workplaces and in society for things that you might describe now as bullying and harassment. But at the same time, it seems to be on the increase. And there's a sort of dynamic going on there. I think, is it because we've become less tolerant, or is it because as society we just seem to be doing more of it? And I think, again, cyberbullying and online bullying is a very, very good indication of that yes, the tolerance, we don't have so much tolerance as we might have had in the past. But the fact is, it is growing. And there are many other ways in which people can be bullied and harassed in workplaces, which aren't just the physical or day-to-day interactions that people have. So as I said, I think there's a lot there to be sort of unpacked around where legislation is helping on this. Clearly, whatever you do, and sorry, just to emphasize beyond legislation, then you get into things like policies. And we are always encouraging businesses to be very clear on their policies on this. So zero tolerance policies around bullying and harassment and what that actually means. And how we want to emphasize these ideas of cultures of dignity and respect, and also how we create those channels and help people understand how they can raise complaints safely, because that links very clearly into this next point about culture. Because whatever we do around legislation and policies, we know a lot of this is about culture and behavior. And a lot of that being driven from the top down, and we know that's where culture starts. So we're doing a lot of work around trying to understand how do we create those cultures of safety where people can speak up, where things like stress in the workplace, which comes from a lot of these different dimensions, is better understood, where we train managers effectively. When you were all talking about prevention, train managers to spot the signs, and they themselves must demonstrate the right behaviors. And that's not easy because we have not got a lot of this training right. I think in many contexts, we're not training arguably at all, or certainly not sufficiently. And that, of course, is another dimension to the culture, that the managers themselves feel under a lot of pressure. They are not necessarily experts in all of these things, but they need to understand the signs. And interestingly, we're talking more now about signs of violence happening outside the workplace. So domestic violence, for example, which is also sadly on the rise. When you see employees coming into work and they might see work as a place of safety because they're trying to get away from an abusive partner, what's our responsibility in work to at least understand the signs and maybe alert the right authorities, or recognize that these people are feeling bullied and harassed, but in context outside of work, not just what's happening inside of work. So there's a lot again around what it is that we need to do to train managers effectively, but recognize, of course, also whilst we talk about managers, and people will talk a lot about training line managers and their responsibilities, if you like, to look after their teams, manage all these diversity and inclusion things. That is putting a lot of load on the managers, and it's how they are supported up the structure as well, which is why, as I said, I will always talk about these things. Let's start from the top. If the culture in an organization is one of bullying and harassment, and not leading by the principles and values that most organizations talk about, then it makes it doubly hard for any manager then to demonstrate that they are trying to support their teams if they are not feeling supported themselves. And equally, if we have these speak up cultures and whistleblowing and all those other things, they are not going to work unless from the top of the organization these are respected and understood, and then we take appropriate action. And those all link together, I think, very much into this sort of wider idea of understanding our cultures, and what we tolerate and what we don't tolerate, and how much we live our values, and how much policies and other things are understood, and how much we're training our managers. So it's a really, really important area, and we certainly welcome the not just the academic research in this field, but also the guidance that you're trying to provide, and which we try to provide, because people are definitely looking for that guidance, and particularly in an environment where we are seeing more focus on these subjects from legislators, and putting more responsibility on employers to provide that duty of care, to make sure that they are taking all reasonable steps to prevent this, when we know that a lot of the legislation, even today, is not always completely clear in a lot of the definitions of some of these behaviours that we've already talked about. So let me leave it there. I'd be interested to see what further questions might come through.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your contribution there, really outlining what HR's role in this and the wider issues. So let me now turn it over to getting some questions from people. If you wanted to raise your hand or put something into the chat. We've got 15 minutes before we end. maybe just while we're waiting, I could just ask both Peter and Anna Catalina if you had a wish list for the top thing that you would really like to have some focus and have some content on, what would it be? Because that would be useful for us at the Impact Incubator in terms of thinking of our next stages of work here.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off on that one, Ros. I mean, as I stressed, I mean, part of our challenge is still this understanding of cultures, and so we write policies, we try to train people, but it's the sort of cultural dynamic which is such an important part of this, and I recognize not the easiest thing to research, but I think that would be one aspect of it, and sort of the sense that employees have of whether things are written down as policies, but are they enacted through consistent behaviors, and particularly, as I said, starting from the top and the leadership. I think the other thing that also is interesting, and it's interesting to all of us because we're trying to provide guidance on these things between us, is what works in terms of training managers. Because at the end of the day, I think we've all said and all acknowledged that, yes, HR has a critical role in all of this and enabling and understanding. But it is the managers who are managing the people. They're on the front line of understanding or at least being aware of where bullying and harassment is happening and how they deal with it. And of course, creating hopefully that sense of trust within their teams that people can speak up if it's happening to them. So what works in terms of good training and what is happening in terms of training of this kind across organizations, and it links into the wider culture question, I think is something that we would all really value.
Thank you, that's a great start. Anna Catalina, do you have any thoughts from an ILO perspective as to what would be really useful?
Certainly. And yes, I think we have a very long wishing list. I would maybe start by what exactly Peter was saying about best practices. It's clear that this is something that also our constituents are looking forward to have, but in terms of what is really effective, right? And not only on the aspects related to training and management of managers, but also on aspects related to the preventive measures to be put in place and workplace cooperation. I think this is also another aspect that is quite important. I mean, we have that, and it has been proved. WHO has interesting information on this about the importance of training managers on all aspects related with, I would say, psychosocial risk management, mental health aspects, and how it is an effective, I would say, strategy. But we have too little information on how other mechanisms that include some workplace cooperation bodies can also be effective on preventing and protecting workers on violence and harassment. The other aspect that I think would be very, very interesting and is linked with that is to have more empirical evidence on the factors that are leading to violence and harassment at work. So what are, I would say, the patterns of interaction between the different risk factors and how change of factors actually leads to reduce violence and harassment. So we know that, for example, leadership plays a very important role. We are speaking about that, but what are all other dimensions of the working environment that have a crucial role, and that we can prove that if we tackle those dimensions, we are reducing the risk of violence and harassment. And finally, I think that all aspects related with, and both of you mentioned the non-standard forms of work, what we call non-standard forms of work, new forms of employment, are very important. So how to address violence and harassment in such settings, such as remote work, and also the new channels through which violence and harassment can take place or can express itself, such as artificial intelligence, metaverse, etc. I think this is something that we really need to look at, because it's already here and will be more present in the upcoming years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. So we've got a question in the chat, and I'll start with Roberta with this one. So what sort of initiatives could help us better understand the signals to detect issues within the workplace culture to try to prevent undesirable behaviour before harm is caused?
Thank you, Rosa. I actually saw this question and in a way, I wanted to share some thinking about. So it's a very important question, because we know and that early detection or signs can be very crucial, because this can decrease the likelihood of escalation. And it's not an easy one. So a lot of the measures that the also policies are recommending is all about the code of conduct, and is all about making sure that there are spaces in which we are discussing about what is appropriate, and I'm using now the language, also the convention, what is appropriate and what not is appropriate. But also, as Peter was saying, and I really absolutely agree on the point, is not about having a policy or a document that is enough. It's about how they are implemented. And what we are seeing, and I work with several organizations, and it's all the same. A lot of companies might have the code of conduct in which they describe what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, but then is left on the website and it becomes a facade of action. What we need, and again, it's not necessarily the only solution, but first we need to be able to have a space in which, again, this also goes back to what are the definitions, how do we monitor, and what is considered appropriate and not appropriate. And so these elements need to be embedded in the context in which leaders, because they are the people that are the drivers of change, needs to address. And having difficult conversation, it's one important element. So in terms of detecting signals, there are the aspect of making sure that we are defining what is appropriate and what is not is appropriate, but we also need reporting systems that allows organizations to actually know what people are experiencing. And I think that this is something that, among the different things, I definitely recognize as an important aspect in order to be able to start detecting. Also, because in the context of also harassment and discrimination, there is a lot of microaggression. And one of the aspects in bullying is ambiguity. And this is the problem that bystanders are having, because it's very easy when there is a very open shouting, but when there are micro forms of aggression where the level of ambiguity is higher, then it's much more difficult for them to actually be able to raise concerns.
Thank you, Roberta. I've just put into the chat a paper that we've recently completed that's looking very much at these kind of clues and signals, and what it's really detecting, particularly in the onset, is creating this crucible that might lead to this subsequently. So this paper is very much focusing on informal routes to reporting, informal ways that signals are missed, and through that, particularly looking at silence and how silence happens. And so people are seeking, particularly when they're in that training function, they're very vulnerable because they don't know what is the right thing to do in this space. They don't know how to report and raise their concerns. And so it becomes really important to recognise how those contexts then shape those structural factors that might remove people from sources of support, and place them at greater harm in different spaces. So this is freely available. We've paid for it to be open access. So
Ross, because it's an interesting question. What are the signals? I mean, as you said, there are some of the things around reporting, but there is going to be a stronger obligation on companies, as I said, in order to better show that you're taking all reasonable steps to prevent it, then you've got to be alert to what are the signals that are telling you whether it is happening in practice. And there are some obvious ones as well, and I think in addition to things we talked about, so things like staff surveys. I mean, are you surveying your staff? Are you asking them how they're feeling, and if so, what's the commentary that's coming back through some of that? And if it's anonymized, then people, which they are, then people may be far more open about how they're feeling about the culture of the organisation. And you're looking for sort of signals there in terms of sources of stress. You got other things like absenteeism. I mean, if absenteeism is starting to climb, then usually it's happening because of things like stress. And one of the big reasons for stress is because people are not feeling safe. They're feeling bullied or harassed in different ways. Exit interviews is also another very good one. When people exit, then that's when they can be really honest. And I've experienced it in work environments too. You have an exit interview, and you suddenly realize the reason the person's exited is because they have been feeling bullied and possibly harassed in a legal sense too. And also, of course, how what's happening through complaints and whistleblowing channels and things like that. Is there anything happening there? I mean, if there's nothing is happening through those channels, then you have to ask that question. But if the things are happening, then of course that's starting to send signals about, well, we're beginning to see a rising incidence of complaints about bullying in a particular part of the organization. So I think there are a number of those different channels which are very good signal indicators to leaders and to HR professionals to help them understand what's going on. Because as we've all acknowledged, and your point, Roberta, about microaggressions is absolutely right. First of all, a lot of this stuff is very misunderstood by managers as well as employees. They don't know when, is this really a bullying thing, or should I be raising it or not? If I raise it, I'm going to be in trouble. All the way through to people understanding the rights and what the law means. So I think it's looking for these other channels as well and just trying to build, from these signals, to Emma's point, as to trying to understand what's really going on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We've also had a comment from Kerry, particularly thinking about senior leaders and their role in terms of that access to information and intelligence. So Kerry, very much as Peter has highlighted, the variety of different metrics that can come through. We did a study with Professional Standards Authority, and we did for the first time where we identified spaces where sexual harassment and abuse had happened, and we looked at the staff surveys, and there was a direct association between places where there were bullying and harassment from patients and service users, from staff members, where there was really high workloads for people, and where there was low levels of EDI training in that space, and also poor quality of interactions and communication between staff and managers. So there are real signals that organisations need to be responding to and being alert around. So we've just got 3 minutes left. So can I ask Roberta for some closing thoughts here for this webinar?
Thank you very much. First of all, a massive thank you to Anna Catalina and Peter Cheese for being here and contributing to what, as EWOP Impact Incubator, we care a lot of understanding how we can actually contribute disseminating science and try to link to interventions and actions in the workplace. So a massive thank you from my side to be part of this webinar. Definitely the take-home message here is very clear. We need to do more about prevention. And we hope that the resources that we are building also at EWOP can help organizations to make a connections between also what the evidence is saying, as Peter was saying before, and Anna Catalina also, about the importance of understanding what the evidence are in relation, for example, the antecedents, and potentially what we need to do possibly even more is to try to connect and translate, maybe with policy brief, some of these, the evidence to help a policymaker on one side, but employers and professionals to prevent. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants today. We will share the recording for all the people that have registered. So thank you.
And I've just put on the screen there, visit us at the ewopimpact.org, and you can see, we'll upload this video, but you'll see also all of the animations will be there and other things associated with this. So please connect with us. We've got an agenda here and we're getting it filled with new signals about where we need to be applying our focus. So thank you very much to all of our speakers, to Roberta Fida, to Anna Catalina Remez, and also Peter Cheese for your time today. Thank you. and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stop recording, and Ross, I will send you the links.